All right, everybody. Welcome back and welcome to the seventh and final unit of AP Human Geography this morning. Um, the seventh and final unit of the course is basically dealing with economic geography and is more formally known as industrial and economic development patterns and processes. So that's where we end the course. And so this is essentially the beginning of the finale, if you will. Um, and if we're going to be talking about industrial and economic development patterns and processes, then it only makes sense that as with most units of this course, that we begin um, with a look at kind of the history of how we got here, right? And so our first lesson is actually a little bit of a mini history lesson again. The challenge of this course is that, it assumes that you've taken world history already, which you haven't. So we need a little bit of background, first of all, in the Industrial Revolution, how it began, how it diffused, and how it kind of leads us to the place we are now as far as industrial and economic development patterns and processes go. Realistically, the manufacturing of goods began long before the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was not the beginning of manufacturing. Um, all of the visuals that you see above are visuals prior to industrialization, where families and communities produce goods in workshops and homes, and merchants traded manufactured products throughout the world. What you're looking at here in the visual are what are known as cottage industries. Cottage industries is basically when families and communities produced goods at home or in small workshops. India has a big tradition and a long tradition of producing goods that were made of iron, of gold, of silver, of brass, of cotton textiles. China and Japan also possessed a substantial industrial base long before the Industrial Revolution. Always good to keep in mind. And historically, in price and quality, Europe's products could never really match those of other parts of the world. But during the colonial period, Europeans gained control over local industries in India, the East Indies, and elsewhere, as you can see on this map. And so, in the end, with the eventual development of technologies that allowed for mass production, the British launched essentially an industrial revolution in which they were able to bury local industries in Asia and in Africa by essentially flooding the market with inexpensive products and forcing their colonies to purchase imported goods from them. So, what was the Industrial Revolution then? And again, anytime you see the term revolution, we talked about this in the political geography unit. The first question always should be, well, what's revolutionary about it? What's the actual revolution? And so in this case, the Industrial Revolution was essentially a series of improvements in industrial technology that completely transformed the manufacturing process. It's not the beginning of industry. It's not the beginning of manufacturing. It's a series of improvements in industrial technology that transformed the process of manufacturing goods. And the big transformation here is the replacement of human and animal power with coal powered engines. That's the revolution. Yeah. The replacement of human and animal power with coal powered engines. And in doing so, we saw an unprecedented expansion in industrial productivity. And the transformation was far more than industrial. Realistically speaking, the Industrial Revolution also resulted in new social, economic, and political inventions, not just industrial ones. As far as like new social realities are concerned, child labor laws come out of the Industrial Revolution. A leisure culture, yeah, where we're looking for and paying for recreational opportunities. A population explosion, which is something that we've talked about extensively already. Um, as far as economic transformation is concerned, this is the birth of capitalism. as far as political inventions are concerned. This is the birth of communism as a form of resistance to the system. So there's a lot more here than just the replacement of human and animal power with coal-powered engines, um, because the effects are going to loom large right to the present day. Now, the changes um, involved in the Industrial Revolution really involved a gradual diffusion of new ideas and techniques over decades. This is not an instant revolution. It's definitely more fast, it's definitely more rapid than, say, the agricultural revolution, the first one that we talked about, but it still is a gradual diffusion that takes place over a period of decades. It's not instantaneous. Now, we mentioned that the Industrial Revolution's hearth was really Great Britain, right? So, what were some of the steps to industrialization that were taken in Great Britain then? Well, the first step simply uh, involved improved spinning wheels that were powered by foot pedals, and new water looms that were driven by water running down slope. So the textile industry really was the first and most important industry involved in the Industrial Revolution. The 18th century was marked with a series of inventions that brought new uses for known energy sources like coal, and new machines to improve efficiency. The most famous and important machine of all, although we're not going to have a long discussion about machinery, but if there was one machine that really drove the Industrial Revolution, it's the one that you're looking at right here. Yeah. And that's the steam engine, which in turn enabled other new inventions like the railroad, right? Because it was the steam engine that was going to power railroad transportation, right? Which allowed the diffusion of industrialization to happen so much faster. Now, you have to understand that all of these inventions of the Industrial Revolution are really risky investments. Yeah. So how are they funded? Well, the 18th century saw a lot of capital coming into Britain as a result of an expanding trade network that focused on Western Europe, that brought wealth to those in a position to take advantage of changing circumstances. And that wealth was used to fund investors. When you're looking at where that wealth was coming from, where that capital was coming from into Great Britain, wow, so much of that capital was coming from colonization in so many ways. Uh, the wealth that was used to fund investors was really coming from colonization in the first place. Um, for example, the steam engine uh, and and innovations in iron manufacturing were absolutely huge investments that paid off big time. Wanting to come back to the steam engine for just a moment, the steam engine in particular had a dramatic impact on industry, from being able to from being used to pump water out of coal mines to powering spinning wheels that spun 100 plus spools of thread at a time, to the creation of the railroad, the first being between Manchester, which was a textile center in England, to the port of Liverpool, which was a shipping center. Yeah. Also, the creation of the steamship comes as a result of of the steam engine. But why Britain? Ultimately, why are we having a conversation about Britain being the place where the Industrial Revolution really takes off? Well, not only did the British hold a near monopoly over the production of many products that were in demand around the world, but Britain alone possessed the skills necessary to make the machines that manufactured them. And it's not to say that the abilities weren't elsewhere, but when inventions were produced in Great Britain, British law kept them state secrets, and so it took a while for these secrets to leak. Let's just put it that way. Not to mention that, once again, and we mentioned this already, Britain had the funding through colonization. It had the capital to really make all this happen. In the earliest period of the Industrial Revolution, manufacturing needed to be located close to coal fields. and manufacturing plants needed to be connected to ports where raw materials could arrive and finished products could depart. Well, if you look at a map, just a basic map of Great Britain, you will notice that Britain had an abundance of coal fields. What you cannot see on this map is that Britain also had an abundance of canals and river systems that connected very well these coal fields to ocean harbors. So that's big geographically. Geography is really setting the stage here. Not to mention at the same time that, your other product that you needed an abundance of to really set off industrialization was iron ore. And Britain had an abundance of iron ore necessary for production. Britain also had the necessary labor force as densely populated and heavily urbanized industrial regions developed near the coal fields, especially in the Midlands of England. Because essentially the agricultural revolution got people off the farm. Now, we understand why Britain, and so the next step is sort of understanding the diffusion process. And you're sort of looking at it here on the next map. As the Industrial Revolution diffused to mainland Europe, proximity to coal fields and connection via water to a port remained absolutely crucial. Those green areas that you're seeing, those green patches that you're seeing on the map here, were generally near major coal fields in Europe. And so you see how the Industrial Revolution's diffusion largely follows that geography. A belt of major coal fields extends from west to east through mainland Europe, across northern France, through southern Belgium, the Netherlands, the German, what's called the Ruhr Valley, that's a major river in Germany, Ruhr. So the German Ruhr region, Western Bohemia and Czechia, and Silesia in Poland. And iron ore is dispersed along a very similarly located belt. So again, notice how the Industrial Revolution kind of followed the geography in a lot of ways. Not to mention that colonial empires provided countries like France, like Britain, like Belgium, like the Netherlands, and Germany eventually access to necessary capital and raw materials that were necessary for industrialization. And so notice, if you look at this colonial map of Asia at this time, who the big players were. Yeah, and the areas that had the biggest chunks of empire, yes, including Japan, which we'll talk about in a moment, the areas that had the biggest chunks of empire tended to be the most industrially successful because they were able to exploit their colonies for whatever raw materials they needed for industrialization in the first place. What's incredibly shocking and interesting is looking at this before and after map of Africa. Yeah. On the left there, Africa 1875, you're still looking at kind of, the earlier, phase of industrialization, still industrialization in its first few decades in Europe and very little colonial possession, right? But in just 25 years, look at the scramble for Africa and look at how all of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, and I guess one could argue Liberia, is taken down by European empires in literally just 25 years because of, again, largely the desire for raw material, amongst other things. The Ruhr area of Germany especially became incredibly important as it was connected to an abundance of coal. And the Rhine River flows all the way to Rotterdam in the Netherlands to connect it to the sea. And so essentially, you talk about a perfectly located place for an industrial boom like what we saw in Germany. And once the railroads were well established, actually, before that, I'm going to pause here because part one is over. I'm out of time on this 15 minutes, and so we'll finish this in the second part.